Want to learn more about the Bushido Code, or the Way of the Samurai? Perfect, because in this video, we're going to cover that. But it might not be quite what you expect. What's up, Internet? Dyce Quirk here, and I hope that all of you are doing incredibly well. So, today in this video, I'm going to start off by telling you what Bushido means. Then, I'm going to tell you why it's so hard to talk about the Bushido Code, or define it. And then, I'm going to give you 2 free awesome resources for learning about the Bushido Code yourself. And then, I'm going to talk about all of the 8 essential elements or virtues that make up the Bushido Code, or the Way of the Samurai. So, let's start off by defining what does Bushido even mean? As it turns out, the word Bushido is actually made up of 2 separate words. The first being Bushi, which translates to warrior or samurai. The second being Do, which Do translates to streetway or teaching. And a lot of people translate it as path or way. And so when you put these 2 words together and get Bushido, you get an idea that this word is supposed to encompass the way of the samurai, or the way of the warrior. And this way of the warrior was actually heavily influenced by Neo-Confucianism, Zen Buddhism, and Shintoism, resulting in a very interesting way of thinking and presenting oneself. So, if it's so easy for us to define the word Bushido, why is it so difficult for some people to talk about the Bushido Code? Why is there some kind of controversy surrounding the Bushido Code? Well, it mainly has to come from our Western perception of what the Bushido Code actually is. Most of us would think that the Bushido Code was a listed kind of set of rules or just ways of living that a samurai would follow. And we think that it's actually something that applied to all samurai for at least most of the history of samurai. When, as it turns out, the first time that we see it written in anything in Japanese history was in the Koyo Gunkan, and that was in 1616, which was after the start of the Tokugawa period, which is incredibly late in the samurai era. In fact, during the Tokugawa period, a lot of samurai were losing a lot of their warrior-like responsibilities because it was a huge time of peace, and the samurai era was coming to an end. Because the term only showed up in this one paper that late, we don't even know if it was being used throughout the rest of Japan until a later period. Having said that, there was an idea that there was this way of the samurai before the term Bushido was coined. And this idea of the way of the samurai,
it kind of leads to some other problems.
Because when we think, us Westerners, of the Bushido Code, we think of a well-organized official system that all samurai would follow. But in all actuality, the Bushido Code, or this Way of the Samurai, would be different depending on what place you were in Japan, or what clan or tribe you were in. So, because there was no official system that was written out and everybody agreed upon, the Bushido Code was actually very inconsistent and scattered. And that's why we don't see a book that just says Bushido Code and has all of the things listed. Or we might see something like that, and there will be a lot of people that would argue with you that there never really was a Bushido Code. Even though there technically was a Way of the Samurai, it just was different depending on where you were in Japan. Now, even though the Bushido Code had a number of inconsistencies as well as never had an official system that was put together, there was one man who tried to take the most essential elements within the Way of the Samurai and put them into one document, so that foreigners would have an easier time understanding the morals as well as the ways of thinking in Japan. And this man's name was Nitobe Inazo. And Nitobe Inazo was actually born into a family with samurai lineage, and so at a young age he was actually taught in the Way of the Samurai. And as he was getting older, he decided to leave Japan and go to some foreign schools in other countries because he felt that the education system in Japan was a little bit lacking at the time. And he actually became a Christian Quaker, believe it or not, when he left Japan. And he also became an incredible foreign ambassador for the country of Japan. In fact, he was so great at being a foreign ambassador, he was featured on the 5,000 yen bill in Japan from 1984 to 2004. And it's actually during this time period that he wrote a book that's world-renowned today, and it's called Bushido, the Soul of Japan. Now, before somebody tries to scold me for bringing up this book, yes, I do know that sometimes this book is heavily criticized for using Christian elements or for using the European code of chivalry to describe samurai ethics. And yes, I do know that sometimes it over-embellishes the samurai ethics. And yes, one more time, I also know that this book is sometimes heavily criticized for making the Bushido Code look more well put together than it actually was. But I do believe that Nitobe answers all of these questions, or at least gives some form of of answer to all of these questions in his book. First off, Nitobe mentions that inside of this book, his purpose is to explain how he and other Japanese people learn morals even though religion was never taught in schools. And so I think that the use of Christian elements as well as European chivalry makes perfect sense, because he's not only trying to make it understandable to a foreign audience, but the entire concept is supposed to be about morals and virtues. He also talks about how Bushido can't really be dated because it has no real starting point. And he goes on to talk about how it was made up of multiple sources and had a scattered mindset. Like he says in this quote, "Unformulated. Bushido was and still is the animating spirit, the motor force of our country. Describes what many may not want to hear, but when understanding Bushido, need to clearly understand. That is, that Bushido never had a clear definition. It really was never some group of rules that actually was written out and everyone agreed upon in Japan. And that's why it can be so difficult sometimes to study and understand it completely, or even make a video like this one that completely outlines it perfectly." Having said that, if you want to learn more about the Bushido Code, then I definitely recommend that you check out Nitobe Inazo's book, Bushido, the Soul of Japan. And that's because he covers the most essential elements about what Bushido is, as well as go so incredibly in depth about each one of those elements, way further than I'm going to be covering in this video, and that's just because there's so much to cover. He goes so deep. And the coolest thing about his book is that it's actually available on Audible. And so, if you sign up using the link that I have in the description of this video, or in the pinned comment below this video, then you can get free access to a premium Audible account. And that'll give you 30 days free access with 2 free books that you would normally have to pay for, and you also have access to all of their normally free books inside of their catalog. And one thing that I love about Audible is that whenever I'm super busy, I still can listen to a book and continue to grow myself. And I tend to be really busy all the time. So I usually listen to Audible when I'm doing laundry, or when I'm washing dishes, or even when I'm driving. In fact, this entire book I listened to during those 3 categories and took notes. And so I just definitely recommend it. You can use either of the links, and if you do that, you actually support not only yourself by growing yourself, but also our channel. So definitely consider it. Also, while researching for this particular video, I actually didn't just listen to Bushido the Soul of Japan. I also listened to another world-renowned book called Hagakure. And Hagakure is basically a collection of anecdotes as well as different pieces of wisdom that make up the essence of Bushido. And listening to this in conjunction with the Bushido Soul of Japan book, you can really get a sense of how it was separate from place to place and different from place to place, but also had shared elements from one portion of Japan to another. So yeah, they're both really great books, and they both give you a good sense of what Bushido actually was. And in addition, Hagakure is a very, very quotable book, and I have a couple quotes that I want to share with you. One is from chapter, I think it's 11 or 12. "If you cut a face lengthwise, urinate on it, and trample on it with straw sandals. It is said that the skin will come off." Another is, "When one departs for the front, he should carry rice in a bag. His underwear should be made from the skin of a badger. This way he will not have lice. In a long campaign, lice are troublesome." Now, I want you to remember that this was from a different time, and back then, they didn't have everything that we have today, and underwear or undergarments have come a long way since then. So, some pretty good stuff. Also, quick side note, I know with those quotes, you're probably going to be interested in listening to Hagakure too. And guess what? It's completely free on Audible for anyone with a premium account. So, if you were to get a premium account with the link I talked about before, you would get Bushido the Soul of Japan, which is one of the paid-for books that you would get for free because you just made an account. You would get another book that you would normally have to pay for free. And then Hagakure is a part of the free library for anyone with a premium account. So then you would get that book as well as hundreds of other books. Just wanted to put that in there real quick. Next, Having said all of that, in Bushido, the Soul of Japan, Nitobe gives 8 essential virtues that make up the Bushido Code, or the most essential elements of the Bushido Code. The first being rectitude and justice. The samurai, this was supposed to define their way of thinking, which they were supposed to always be pursuing truth. And this particular element, or this particular virtue, was supposed to be the skeletal structure that all of the other virtues were built on. The second element that Nitobe brings up is courage, which he defines as doing what is right. And so courage, in a samurai's way of thinking about it, actually required a little bit of discernment, because a samurai would have to know when it was best to die and when it was best to live. And to act on that was actually a act of courage. And in addition, Nitobe goes into great gruesome detail about how parents would actually try to instill a sense of calmness into their children so that they could be courageous when the time came. For example, they would prevent their children from eating. They would give them less food so that they would be used to hunger.
They would expose their children to cold. They would have their children watch decapitations. They would also have their child go out at night alone to the place where the decapitation took place and actually leave a mark on the head of the body.
And so these are just a few of the gruesome things that Nitobe brings up for how parents would teach courage to their children if they were a part of a samurai family. And the third virtue, which Nitobe mentions, is benevolence, which he calls a supreme virtue compared to all of the others. And this particular virtue was derived from empathy. It was derived from affection for others, as well as from pity. And this was one of the elements or virtues that had to be balanced for a samurai. And Nitobe goes on to explain how a samurai would need to balance this by using a quote from Masamune. And the quote was, "Rectitude carried to excess hardens into stiffness. Benevolence, indulged beyond measure, sinks into weakness." So, you can see how if somebody were to indulge in too much benevolence, showing too much mercy, they could be seen as weak by other samurai. Whereas if they didn't indulge enough in it, they would be seen as strict and harsh. Or, like the quote says, they would harden into stiffness and they might be set in their ways. So, benevolence also had an element of flexibility. The next virtue that Nitobe brings up is politeness. And when he brings this up, he actually gives a very clarifying statement for what politeness truly is. And this is what he says. "Politeness is a poor virtue if it is actuated only by a fear of offending good tastes, whereas it should be the outward manifestation of a sympathetic regard for the feelings of others." Nitobe even goes on to say that politeness approaches a Christian mindset of love, and he even makes his own version of Corinthians 13, 4-7. Here's a quick side-by-side comparison of the two so that you can see how he made his own version of this particular set of verses. The next element or virtue that Nitobe brings up is veracity and sincerity. Lying and equivocation was seen as cowardly to a samurai, and so many samurai actually saw themselves as being in such a high position that they needed to hold themselves to a higher standard when it came to pursuing truth. Then there's the virtue of honor, or one's reputation. And surprisingly enough, inside of the chapter that's supposed to be focused more on honor, it actually focuses more on how shame influences one's actions within the Bushido. Because, quote, "Any infringement upon one's name's integrity was felt as shame, and the sense of shame, ren chi shin, was one of the earliest to be cherished in juvenile education. And, quote, shame is the soil of all virtue, of good manners and good morals." The next virtue that Nitobe goes over is the extreme levels of loyalty that a samurai would embrace for their masters, or even the extreme levels of loyalty that people inside of a tribe would do for their superiors, even sacrificing their own family members for the sake of their superiors or for the good of all. And this was an interesting chapter with a very heart-touching story, so I recommend that you check it out. And finally, the last virtue that Nitobe brings up when he talks about the virtues of the samurai is self-control. Essentially, you're supposed to have a levelness of mind. You should have a calmness in behavior and a composure of mind. Now, basically, what this meant was anytime you had your emotions being stirred up, your spirit being stirred up, it was natural and expected that you would suppress it. Basically, any emotions that actually popped up on your face, like if you had a breach in your levelness of mind where you were extremely sad, extremely angry, or extremely happy, and it breached your face, that was seen as unmanly, and it was also seen as a breach in your self-control. And wow, that's a lot. But the book also covers a number of other interesting subjects as well. In fact, the other chapters include suicide and redress, the sword, the soul of the samurai, the training and position of women. That is a very interesting chapter I think that you should read because it might be surprising to you. Then there is the influence of Bushido. Is Bushido still alive? And the future of Bushido. Now, in this video, I definitely had to skim over each one of those virtues, and that's just because inside the book, he goes so deep into each one of them that there is no way I could cover it in this video. And also, if you're interested in learning more about Bushido or learning more about those different topics, because again, it's such a good book, I would recommend that you either listen to it or you read it yourself. And so, in the description of this video and in the pinned comment below, I've included a link to the Amazon book so that you can get a physical copy if you're interested in physical books. And also, I have included a link to that Audible account where you can get a free premium account for 30 days and you'll get access to 2 free books that you normally would have to pay for. One of them can be Bushido, the Soul of Japan, and the other one could be whatever you want. And then you also have access to their entire free library of books so that you can continue to grow yourself even when you're busy. And in addition to that, I just wanted to say, if you found this video informative or helpful, please consider clicking that like button. Don't smash it. We're not violent here. Just click it, okay? Just a little click. And also, if you're interested in our Japan-related content, why not consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell so that you can know when we come out with new Japan-related content. So, with all that said, thank you so much, and Dyce Quirk out.